Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted this Soviet SU-85. This model is the plastic kit from Rubicon models that I built a while ago. It's a pretty decent kit. If you would like to see the build video, there's a link in the description and in the card in the upper right corner of the video now. I have painted Soviet vehicles in the past, and I've normally used Vallejo paints for the green base coat. I thought for something different I would try this red tanks set, by which they mean red army tanks, not tanks that were painted red, because using greens to paint red is obviously not going to work. This set is by Scale 75, and I've only heard good things about them, though to be fair I haven't really heard a whole lot, but why not try them? Here's a comparison with Vallejo Model Air Russian Green. As you can probably tell by my marking, the Scale 75 colour is at the top. It's pretty messily sprayed and it isn't on a model, but this is good enough to show you how different the colours are. The Scale 75 colour is much more green. Which is correct for a Soviet tank? Who knows? I would be inclined to say probably both. I don't believe paint colour consistency would have been a high priority for the Red Army. Anybody that tells you that all Soviet tanks were exactly the same colour is probably on drugs. Enough waffling. I started this as usual by priming the model. In this case I've used Steinel Res, which is a fine primer, though you can of course feel free to use whichever primer you like. I then apply the base coat using Scale 75 Russian Green. Because this is a base coat, it's obviously going all over the vehicle. This Scale 75 paint is quite thick coming out of the bottle, like really thick. Obviously it can be thinned, but it was quite the challenge for me to get it thinned enough, and it did clog my airbrush a couple of times, which is obviously annoying. But I'm certain with more time and use I would easily figure out how much thinner I needed to use. That was my main issue with these paints, otherwise they go on like pretty much any other paint really. One thing I will say is that I was a little taken aback by the colour of this stuff when it's wet. It's definitely not what I was expecting, and it is very green. But then it dries and it looks significantly different and very matte, which I rather like. I almost wish I could leave it like this because it's a very nice finish, but it wouldn't make for a very interesting model, would it? So I airbrush on a highlight with Scale 75 Russian Light Green. This handles pretty much exactly the same way as the other colour. It's thick so it does need a lot of thinning, but once you get that right it's pretty easy to spray. I apply it mostly from the top down, and I did go quite heavily on the top of the model. But I also apply it around the top of the sides as well, where I've tried to blend it in a little bit. I think the result I got here was pretty good, and I think the colours are very nice. Unfortunately, there are some marks on the model where water has been splattered on it. That's no fault of the paint though, so just ignore it I guess. Subsequent washes should take care of that. Moving on, I add another highlight, this time using a makeup brush. I did consider just adding some model colour buff to the green, but I figure that's not really in the spirit of trying these paints out. So I made a mix of roughly 3 parts of the light Russian green to 1 part Scale 75 Sahara sand. I dry brush it onto all of the edges and raised detail-y bits. This is obviously pretty simple, but it is effective and brings out the details nicely, giving the model a more 3-dimensional look. Clearly it is already a 3-dimensional object, but doing this will make that fact more apparent from a distance. Or at least that's the thinking behind it anyway. If you wanted to, you could add even more highlights going progressively lighter, both in colour and application. But for me, this was enough. And that's it for the Scale 75 paints. Obviously the 4 colours in this package aren't quite enough to finish the tank. I'll talk a bit more about them at the end of the video. Next, I apply some gloss varnish to the sides of the casemate so that I can apply the decals. I also got a few more splashes. I figure it's from the bubbles in my shrimp tank on my desk. All the decals I'm applying here are from a Rubicon kit. I have no idea if it's from this specific kit or not because I've got a whole pile of them in my decal drawer. Just as I suspected they would, they go on pretty easily. I don't think I really need to talk too much about the application of decals. As you can see, I've got a star and a different slogan on each side of the casemate. I'm not sure what either of the slogans say, something Russian no doubt. Next, because Soviet tanks aren't exactly known to have the neatest paint application, I apply a tiny bit of Vallejo Model Air White to the decals. I'm adding drips coming down from the markings, but I'm also adding little bits to the sides of the letters in an attempt to make them look a little bit more hand-painted and less precise. I only apply these to the slogans, because I figure the stars would likely be applied at the tank factory with a stencil or something, so they'd be a little bit neater. I tried not to go overboard with this, and I think I got a fairly good result. I'm pretty happy with the base colours, and I don't want to alter them too much, but I am going to give the entire model a wash with Army Painter Strong Tone. This is thinned roughly 1 part Strong Tone to 3 parts water, and I just apply it all over the model. I'm not being especially neat with it, but I am trying to avoid pooling. We don't want any more tide marks than we already have from those splatters earlier. The hope is this wash is going to hide those, so we don't want to add any more. I leave the wash to dry, and then I paint the tracks. For this I used Vallejo model colour Black Grey. Ordinarily I would do the chipping before this, but I didn't really feel like doing chipping at that point in time. Painting the tracks better fit into the small amount of time I had, so I did that. It's good to be flexible sometimes. This is pretty easy, of course. It's a good idea to use a larger brush on the larger areas, and then come in with a smaller brush to get the smaller areas around the drive sprockets and wheels and things like that. Of course, don't forget the spare track links on the front of the hull, and the ones on the side. That is, if you've got them. If you don't, well, it'll be impossible to paint them if you don't have them, so don't worry about it. Then I figured I might add a kind of highlight. I used model colour London Grey and applied it along the edges of the tracks and along the tops of the guide horns. I would normally apply this kind of thing with a dry brushing, but I didn't feel like it was worth getting the grey on the sides of the hull or the wheels like I would probably accidentally do with a dry brushing. So I thought, why not just use a regular brush and paint it on? This doesn't have to be too neat or subtle, because it's not subtle, and it doesn't look very good right now, but it will mostly be obscured by the track wash I'll be applying later. The idea here is that this will add some colour variation and, hopefully, interest to the tracks once that wash is applied. It's kind of an experiment really, I'm not entirely sure how it's going to turn out, but I figure it was worth trying. Obviously I'm also applying this to the spare track links, as well as the ones installed in the regular track locations. I follow this with some chipping. This is pretty much the same old chipping technique that I usually use, and if you want more information on it, there's a link in the description and in the upper right corner of the video. The colour mix is roughly 70% model colour Black Grey and 30% Mahogany Brown. As an experiment, I added a tiny little bit of London Grey to the mix. I'm trying to go pretty lightly with this. I want this to be a somewhat fresh and newish looking vehicle. Not super clean, but clean enough. I figure doing this after painting the tracks may help to add a tiny bit of colour variation to them if I do happen to accidentally get this on the tracks. Using the same colour mixture, I take a fine brush and add some additional scratches. This is pretty simple, you just have to be careful not to apply too thick a brush stroke. It's meant to look like a scratch rather than a stroke of paint, obviously. Then I painted the exhaust pipes with model colour Mahogany Brown. In my opinion, this is a pretty good base colour for rusty things, and these exhaust pipes are usually quite rusty, though that is often hidden under a layer of soot. Now it's time to paint the tyres. I'm using AK Interactive rubber tyres for this. It seems like a good choice, and I quite like the colour. It doesn't look too different from the grey I painted the tracks with, but it is different. Some people have mentioned to me that they find painting wheels hard, and to be fair it is a little bit tricky, but if you're careful and go slowly it's not too bad. To be honest, I'm actually kind of surprised how neatly I got this done this time. I do often have to make corrections to the wheel rims at least. Then I thought I might try something to add a bit of depth to the grills. I added some black to them, specifically Vallejo Model Air Black, which I've thinned a fair bit. Maybe 50-50 with thinner, if not more. It is quite thin. I did try to be fairly neat in putting this into the grills. It wasn't quite perfect though, and I used some paper towel to dab some of the colour away, and also a brush to scrub it away, and also kind of blend it in and add to the weathering on the tank. It didn't quite work as I'd hoped it might, but it's not too bad. It does make the grills appear to have more depth, and that's what I wanted. Perhaps this is something I can do better in the future. Then, in preparation for the enamels, I apply a coat of gloss varnish to the entire model. You can see how it darkens everything down a bit. That's okay, the final matte coat should lighten things up again. You can probably see, at some point I managed to knock off and lose the right rear toolbox. That's a bit annoying, but I'll just add a bit of extra weathering there later. We can just imagine somebody stole it, or maybe it was traded for vodka. It probably won't surprise anyone to learn that I'm using AK Interactive Track Wash on the tracks. This is pretty simple. I do my best to avoid painting the areas that aren't tracks, like the wheels or the hull. As with earlier, it does help to use a smaller brush when trying to paint around things like the wheels. And if you do make mistakes, it is pretty easy to clean up. Just use a clean brush with some clean thinner, and you can either wipe it off or blend it into the model to add to the weathering. You can tell I've used the wrong camera setting here and all the colours look gross and weird, but it's obvious what I'm doing. Applying track wash to the spare track links, just in case it wasn't obvious. I would suggest not forgetting to do these or they'll look weirdly different to the rest of the tracks. I don't know about you, but I don't want that. With the colours back to normal, I apply a little bit of the track wash to the exhaust pipes. This is simple enough and shouldn't really need any explaining. Then comes some AK Interactive Dark Brown Wash for green vehicles. For once I'm using this on a green vehicle. Nice. This is thinned roughly 50-50 with white spirit. You can use the AK Interactive branded thinner if you really want to, but it is significantly cheaper to buy white spirits in a big bottle from the art supply, or maybe the hardware. As you can hopefully see, I'm mostly applying this to all the gaps and recesses. The idea is to add some depth to the model, and maybe add to the slightly dirty appearance. I am being a little bit messy, but it's easy enough to remove this if you make too much of a mess. Just use a clean brush with clean thinner and you can wipe it away like nothing. Then, to protect what I've just done, I applied another coat of gloss varnish. Then, I apply some AK Interactive Dark Streaking Grime for green vehicles. I do intend this to be a fairly clean vehicle, but not super clean, so I don't want to use too much of this. I apply small amounts of it in downward streaks in areas where I think some grime might streak. As you can see, I'm applying this and then using a clean brush with clean thinner to remove a lot of the streaking grime in downward strokes. You know, to simulate grime that has been streaked down the vehicle with rain. Kind of like it suggests on the bottle. It's a nice and subtle effect, which is just what I wanted. Then I applied a small amount of AK Interactive Light Rust Wash to the spare track links. I used my brush with clean thinner to spread it out and blend it in, and remove a lot of the rust. I didn't feel like it was worth applying this to the main tracks. I imagine that the spare track links have been sitting around long enough to get a bit of that bright orange rust showing on them, while the main tracks haven't. I wasn't sure this would be great, but I think it's turned out to be okay. I applied a tiny bit of this rust wash on the exhaust pipes too, but I didn't film that owing to being a numpty. Now for a bit of a dusty dirty effect. I'm going to risk doing this without another layer of gloss varnish between it and the previous enamels. This is AK Interactive Summer Kursk Earth, which has been thinned quite a lot. I didn't measure the exact ratio, or even a vague ratio. It's just very thin. And I just sort of slather this onto the lower areas of the vehicle. The idea here is that this will mostly gather around the gaps and corners and things like that and create a sort of dusty look there. I'm kind of hoping that it might look like light mud that has been on the vehicle, and then been removed by wind or rain or whatever, which hasn't managed to force it out of the corners and gaps, if that makes sense. I figured this would produce a different effect than simply airbrushing on a dust coat. It's kind of an experiment and I wasn't entirely sure I would like the result, but it turns out I thought it was okay, so I applied another coat of gloss varnish. Then I take some Vallejo Model Air Black and put it in the ends of the exhaust pipes and the main gun. Then I dry brush it around the exhaust pipes. This is obviously to represent soot. It's pretty subtle and Model Air colours don't normally make for good dry brushing paints because they're quite thin, but I did want light soot here, and I think I got close to that, eventually. And that was about all I could think to add. I was kind of tempted to add some airbrushed on dust, but then I figured the matte varnish would most likely add a slightly dusty look to the model anyway, and I didn't want it to be too dirty, so I did nothing further to it before applying said matte varnish, which in this case is AK Interactive Ultra Matte. As a finishing touch, I take a 2B graphite stick and run it along the ends of the tracks. There's not really any convincing detail there to bring out, but the effect is still nice. I also run it along the sides of the tracks, and with that, the 28mm scale plastic SU-85 by Rubicon Models is complete. I'm pretty happy with the result. Of course, there's always room for improvement. If you can't find anything to improve in your work, then you're probably not looking hard enough. On this model, I've done things slightly different to what I normally would do, and it is good to get out of the comfort zone. I often apply dust with an airbrush, but this time I wanted less dust and more, I guess you could say, memories of dust, if that makes sense. I wanted the vehicle to look relatively new, but still look as though it's been in the war. And I think I got there, though maybe I did go a little bit overboard with chipping. This was largely a test of the Scale 75 paints. I have had them for quite a while, though in that time I don't think I've painted anything Soviet except for those field guns I did at the start of the year. I didn't really think they would make good test subjects though. I'm very happy with the colours, though their thickness made them a bit annoying to apply. I'm sure once I find the sweet spot with thinning, they'll go on without issue though. They do end up looking quite nice and really matte, and I rather like that. The colours do change significantly from their wet, freshly applied state to when they're dry, so if you are using them and unsure of how the colour is going to turn out, I would definitely suggest testing them first. Actually, that really goes for any paint. Testing is always a good idea if you're unsure, or even if you are sure. As for colour accuracy, I couldn't really tell you. I think it looks fine. It looks like a Russian tank. Somebody is likely to have a cry about it or get all bent out of shape because they think they know exactly the perfect shade that every single Russian tank was painted in, but just shh, just be quiet. If you've been around my channel for a while, you'll probably know that I'm not really interested in being extremely accurate. The model looks right and that's enough for me. Going to painstaking extremes to get a colour match sounds kind of miserable to me, not to mention time consuming. And even then, how accurate is it really going to be? And how much does it matter? I mean, if that's your thing, that's cool, have fun. It's not something I'm going to do though. Obviously there's not really enough colours in this little red tanks pack that I got to actually paint an entire tank. I guess it's really only for the hull. Maybe they have other packs for tracks and weathering colours. But I've been too lazy to investigate, and while I do like the paints, I'm not going to run out and replace all of my Vallejo colours with them because that would be expensive and silly. That said, I might pick up a few more colours in their range. I know you can get individual colours, and they do work great for dry brushing because of how thick they are. So it might be worth getting a couple of colours that are commonly used for dry brushing from Scale 75. I guess you could say that I didn't really do an in-depth review of these paints, but I felt like showing them in regular use was a better choice than spending a lot of time doing an A-B comparison on something less relevant like cardboard. Anyway, I think I might be getting into rambling territory. Like I said before, I'm pretty happy with the result I got on this SU-85. The one thing it's missing is the traditional Soviet log. I was meaning to get some sticks from outside and make a couple of those, because I do have other tanks that lack them as well. We talked about it on the modelling stream I did last week. By the way, I am going to be doing semi-regular modelling streams, so give me a follow on Twitch if that interests you. Anyway, I haven't got around to making those Soviet logs yet, so I think I might do a separate video on them. Even without the traditional log, this SU-85 will make a fine addition to my Soviet force. For those interested, there's a list of colours I've used in the description below, though obviously you can use any colours you like on your own models. I don't think I've done anything particularly special in this video, and I'm sure you could replicate what I've done without issue. But if you do have any questions, feel free to ask in the comment section below. Any other comments are welcome there too. I do like to hear what you think. Also, don't forget to subscribe, follow, ring the bell, and all the other things you do on YouTube and social media. Links to all of the things including Patreon and my merch store are in the description below. And as always, I shall return soon, so until then, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.